for coming to.
There we go.
Okay. Thank you for coming to the Dharma talk today. And we are delighted to have Brian McLeod give a Dharma talk this morning. And Brian has been studying and practicing Buddha Dharma since 1978. And he attended the first academy at the Dharma Center, which was a 3-year commitment. And since then, really, Brian's been teaching, in particular, annually in Germany, but also in 1999 when he moved to Winnipeg. He started up the River and Bridge community, and he has quite a substantial group and committed Dharma practitioners there. Brian also has a degree in forestry and management, and also does a lot of consulting and conflict resolution. So he's a very well-rounded individual. What Brian brings to the table, which is quite unique, is his ability to weave the Buddha Dharma or awakening in life. So, and this is one of the struggles with practitioners that we see and witness, that it gets compartmentalized. Okay, I'm doing a retreat, and now I'm not in retreat, and I'm off, in the world. And we love the way Brian integrates the Buddha Dharma into your life and enriching your lives and all of our lives. So thank you, Brian, and we look forward to your talk today.
Well, thank you, Karen. And thank you, Karen Meredith, for inviting me to do this. It's interesting seeing who's here. I haven't seen Daria for 40 years, I don't think, but hello. And hello to Lisa and Sophie. It's nice to see a few familiar faces, not to mention some from Winnipeg and one from Deutschland. Just as background, as Karen said, I'm, I have to start with this, well-rounded. Unfortunately, I have been trying to lose the same 15 or 20 pounds for about 30 years, so I hope not to be so round in the near future. But yeah, I was at the Dharma Center for about 5 years in the 1980s. And so when people ask me questions about pop music from the 1980s, for example, I just have to say, sorry, missed the 80s. But it was a great experience. But coming out of 5 years at the Dharma Center, I felt it was really necessary to figure out how to integrate what I'd learned in that kind of secluded bubble of the Dharma Center with life in the world. So I moved to the Arctic because Lama Mark Weber, my friend, invited me to come and start a business with him there. So we started an industrial tool business, which everybody does when they come out of 5 years of living at a retreat center. And I bought him out after about a year. And then I sold it after 7 years, and then had 10 years of working with Inuit organizations in the Arctic. So I lived in the Eastern Arctic for about 17 years. And there are a few things that, I would recommend if you want to have a life in the world. One of them is to spend some time working in retail. My friend here in Winnipeg who ran a bookstore for 40 years, and I thought we should write a book called Awakening Through Retail, because you have absolutely no choice about who comes through the door. So a lot of my experience of Dharma has been filtered through working in economic development and running businesses and working with government on the other side of the negotiating table and that sort of thing. So I've had kind of a checkered career on the Dharma front. I also have two sons who the first one was born when I was 45. And so they're this month, they're going to be 25 and 23. They both have, or next month, they both have birthdays in May. And we live in a nice urban neighborhood in Winnipeg and have a nice house and car and all that. So I haven't exactly taken the way of the wanderer, you know, I haven't had the bhikkhu life. But this is how things happen. One of the most important points I would like to make for anybody who's got a Dharma practice is just have faith in your own life rather than saying, oh, I should have done this or I should have done that. You are wherever you are for a reason. And basically what you need to do every day is just get up and recommit and, you know, pick yourself up off the floor and keep going. And this is sort of one of the core teachings in Dharma is just don't give up, just keep going. And I know it's a funny place to start a talk like this, but it's one of the most important things I've learned over nearly 50 years is that the Dharma is wonderful. The conditioned self, perhaps a little less so. And that's kind of what you have to stick handle around is who is this and why is he doing what he's doing? So what we're going to talk about today is the Four Noble Truths as the foundation of your practice or the foundation of Buddha Dharma generally. And I'd recommend that you read the first discourse that the Buddha gave, which is called the Turning of the Wheel, Sutta, because pretty much everything that he talked about for the next 45 years there's a seed of it there. It's a spectacular introduction to this entire teaching because it's a sort of code for what you need to do. And so the first three truths we'll get into, and then the fourth one includes the Eightfold Path. And if you start to look at the Eightfold Path carefully, each one of those elements is a gateway into a huge area of study. And so it's this interesting sort of encapsulation that starts with what looks like a small thing, and then it just blossoms out in all directions. And provides you with a path. And when I started, I got interested in Buddha Dharma quite young. I was very lucky. I was very lucky to get hepatitis when I was in India when I was 20 years old, because it made me sit down for a month and read books. And I had two books about Buddha Dharma. And I'd been to Sarnath sort of by accident. And then I got to Bodh Gaya sort of by accident. And then I got sick. Perhaps not so much by accident. And I started reading about this teaching. And the first thing that I noticed, because I was in Jane, who's on this call, does a lot of Enneagram stuff. And I believe in the Enneagram, I'm in the quadrant or the section that's called a tragic romantic, you know, like, so when I came across this idea that there was suffering, I was like, yes, because for me at that time, it was the, you know, very 19th century romantic version of suffering that I was invested in, you know, where there is this shift in European culture that started with what was called the Enlightenment, which was a kind of enlightenment. And a lot of the push there was to glorify the individual. And so a lot of my conditioning was to create this perfect suffering individual, according to the formula in the West at the time. And so I thought, yes, because I was depressed and emotionally messy and all the rest. And I thought, well, this guy's got a handle on things. And the cessation of suffering part of the program was appealing, but I kind of spent a few years, if not decades, working mostly on the suffering part. Um, and so what we'll be talking about is really how is this teaching relevant to what's going on in my life and perhaps in the world right now. And I think as background, what we need to look at is an idea that's deep in Buddha Dharma, which is samsara. Many of you have heard about nirvana because there are rock bands and chocolate and all sorts of things that are named nirvana. Maybe not so much samsara. And it's necessary to start to understand the background of the teaching in this case, because the Buddha's basic observation is that samsara is unsatisfactory. And samsara means this world that we think of as being normal life, this world of appearances, if you want to call it that, or the physical world or the phenomenal world, what we think of as just being regular, ordinary life with people and job and trees and cats and all the rest of it. And his observation was that this is inherently messy. And you know from your own experience that it is full of contradiction. And yet all of us are trying to create this plausible narrative that is without contradictions about our lives. And the central character in that narrative is me. And you see these contradictions as being inconvenient or character flaws where there's just, your life is messy and you're going to have contradictory desires. The standard one that I have used, and some of you heard this before, is that I want to eat that piece of black forest cake and I want to lose 10 pounds. And these two exist simultaneously in my brain, but they are not going to work. One of them is going to win out. Fortunately, I have a heart condition now, so the black forest cake is less appealing because it sets off an arrhythmia in my heart. And so the life has created a very tidy sort of solution to that particular one. But the main point is that samsara is full of contradictions. And there's a word that is translated as suffering, which is kind of the essence of the samsara, which Namgyal Rinpoche used to say was about things banging against each other, because the first syllable is D-U-K and the second syllable is K-H-A. So it's duk-ka, and there's always this k-ka in the middle of it. And this is a representation of your life. And it's not a bad thing, it's the nature of this phenomenal world. But as my friend and teacher, Lama Sydney in BC, Lama Tsultrim, would say, one of the difficulties or one of the truths that we have to face is that, in his words, everybody has a secret plan for lasting happiness in samsara. And this is super interesting, and it's worth taking 3 or 4 minutes. I recommend you grab a pen and some paper, and we'll just take 3 or 4 minutes and just start to think about what your secret plan is for happiness. Because a lot of it has to do with things being other than they are. If only I had a different job. If only I had a different partner. If only things had worked out with that person 30 years ago. If only I was taller or shorter or thinner or, smarter. Um, and these contribute to our ongoing dissatisfaction because we've always got this idea that things should be different from how they are. So just be completely honest with yourself. We're not going to be sharing these or marking them or anything, but just think about, what is my secret plan for lasting happiness in samsara? And just as a hint, it usually doesn't include dying. Okay, well, that's a short period to give you, but I recommend this as homework, house of Goblin, for you to take into at least one contemplation session. Just sit down for 20 or 30 minutes. When I've done this, usually the contents are to go back to some imaginary place. It's like fundamentalism, to go back to a place that probably never really existed, um, to have some situation that in your imagining is ideal or was ideal, and to as one of the definitions of suffering from Namgyal was to try to make permanent that which is impermanent. And so one of the cornerstones of this secret plan that everybody has is that you're trying to create a solid palace out of the water that is samsara. And yet we continue, like the brain is structured this way. It's not your fault, and you didn't create this. but the brain is designed to model possible realities. And so there is always going to be this kind of fantasy world until you look at it really closely and go, that's probably not going to work. So what I'm proposing to do now is to just read Thich Nhat Hanh translation of the core stanzas in the uh, Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, the turning of the wheel of Dharma, um, to see what we're talking about as our topic today. So this is Thich Nhat Hanh's translation, which is similar to most of them. Here, bhikkhus, is the noble truth of suffering. So just as an aside, this is one of those false Buddha quote things where people say life is suffering. This is not what the Buddha said. He said, this is the noble truth of suffering. Birth is suffering, old age is suffering, sickness is suffering, death is suffering, sorrow, grief, mental anguish, and disturbance are suffering. To be with those you dislike is suffering. To be separated from those you love is suffering. Not having what you long for is suffering. In other words, to grasp the five aggregates, which is to believe that your body or your feelings or your perceptions or concepts you have about the world or your internal conversation are a true and real self, as though they constitute a self, that is suffering. Here, bhikkhus, is the noble truth of the cause of suffering. It is the desire to be born again, to delight in being born again, to be attached to the pleasures found in this and that. There is craving for sense pleasures, craving for becoming, and craving for not becoming. Here, bhikkhus, is the noble truth of the ending of suffering. It is the fading away and ending of craving without any trace. It is giving up, letting go of, being free from, and doing away with craving. Here, bhikkhus, is the noble truth of the path that leads to the end of suffering. It is a noble eightfold path of right view, right thinking, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right diligence, right mindfulness, and right concentration. So we're not going to get into the details of the Eightfold Path today. That's like worth 10 hours all on its own. But what we're going to look at is the two phases of this Four Noble Truths teaching. And the first one is the truth of suffering. And it says that birth is suffering and old age is suffering. Birth, sickness, old age, and death are all suffering. And that not having what you want is suffering, and being stuck with what you don't want is suffering. But most of these are on their own, taken kind of objectively. If you're in a meditative state and not attached, there may be suffering there, but there's not a personal experience of it. So he says in the second truth that the cause of suffering is craving, is wanting. And essentially, this is the essence of the cause of the suffering of your secret plan for perfect happiness in samsara, is that it's based in craving or wanting or mild hankering for to have something that's not present right now in your life. And, we're driven by this, and certainly I'm not going to go all socialist here, but corporate and consumer society is fueled by dissatisfaction. The present politics are fueled by dissatisfaction, because if people are satisfied, they would stop buying all that stuff. And so you have to kind of crank it up and make sure that I don't know how many of you have been into a dollar store recently, but it certainly is a teaching in excess, where there's just all this material that's being churned out in the hundreds of millions of pieces for who knows what. So one of your other pieces of homework is to ask yourself, well, what is meant by suffering? We can't get into that too deeply, but it doesn't mean, like when I first started, of course, because of my spectacular emotional state, I thought that suffering was like, deep depression or this sort of being torn to pieces that I used to experience breaking up with these women that I was going out with, and it happened about every 3 months. So I was torn up a lot of the time. But suffering covers this incredible spectrum from just mild, oh, I'm not sure I like that, and the preferencing that goes with that, all the way through to like terror and death and terrific hell states. It's a spectrum of experience rather than just a sort of, oh, my suffering. And what's interesting is that you need it for the path. You need to observe it and you need to come to terms with it for yourself and other people. So, although the second half of this teaching is the cessation of suffering, the cessation of suffering is to enter into a new view of things. It is to enter into the realm of understanding what the nature of suffering is. But sadly, the suffering itself doesn't stop. You're still subject to sickness, old age, and dying. And if you go with the traditional view of things, you're subject to rebirth. But what you probably need to start looking at is, how does this work? And how can I turn this from being a big negative into being a teaching? There's a traditional teaching that started with a tisha that was amplified or refined by a number of different Tibetan teachers called Lojong. And there are places in Lojong where they say very clearly that you should turn all mishaps into the path, or whatever you meet is the path. And this is extremely important because a lot of the time, what we try and do is steer around suffering. And there's this idea that the cessation of suffering is going to end you up in some kind of 5-star resort. And that's just the realm of the Dewas. That's just the realm of irresponsibility and kind of temporary pleasure. And really, and this isn't about beating yourself up or about, at some point when you're stable, you can go into dredging everything that's happened. But mostly to the point is that it's likely that the things that you find hardest are going to be the best teachers for you. That, well, as an example, when I was 45 when my first son was born, as I said. So when I was in my early 40s, I, done my 3 years at the Dharma Center and the training thing, and I'd been the manager of the Dharma Center, and like I thought I'd solved most of the problems. And I was kind of like that guy in the patent office, the famous guy in the patent office who, before quantum mechanics was invented, said that we pretty much solved all the problems there are in physics. There are just a few clouds on the horizon. Well, I recommend that you have children. Thank you, Denise, for that demonstration, because children will um, do it for you. Um, if you think you've got it all sorted out, just wait until somebody shits in the living room, and then things are different all of a sudden, and you're having these reactions, and I thought I had it all together, and I didn't. Um, but I started referring to Thomas and William as the two little Rinpoches at home because they knew where all my buttons were, and I thought I'd done away with the button concept, but there we were, and it was fantastic, and it's difficult and it's heartbreaking and all the rest of that, but it's something you have to do. I'm not saying you all have to go out and have children, but what you have to do is embrace whatever the adversity is rather than trying to uh, put it out as being somewhere else. And this is to start into the cessation of suffering, is to start to get insight into this adversity and how we use the complexity of our thought processes to create an out there that we then start to relate to as being a real thing. So just think of J.D. Vance. Think of somebody that you might have difficulty with, and you've never met the guy, you don't know what's going on, but just me saying that, I can see people going, ah. But you don't know who J.D. Vance is. You don't, I mean, I'm not saying he's a nice guy. I'm not pretending that, but you have absolutely no idea who that being is. And so what is it that you are relating to when you have this reaction? Um, and for those of you that have been in a cave for a while, this is the Vice President of the United States we're talking about. What you're relating to is a model that you've created and externalized as a sort of secondary psychic space, and then the you that you think of as you starts relating to what you think of as being this external thing, but it's all just created in the present moment in your mind. And it's really important to understand this, that you will start, once you start to understand that your feelings are your feelings, so your feelings about J.D. Vance or about people you have, difficult people at work or whatever, are your feelings generated in your consciousness rather than some kind of external verifiable truth, then you might start to find out how do we make some steps forward here into understanding suffering, because craving is entirely subjective. Wanting and aversion and all that are entirely subjective. Yet we have this idea that everybody's having the same experience. And again, our cultural ways of doing things push us into believing that. And it's, whether you belong to a church or whether you belong to a political party or an environmental movement or whatever, or a sangha, there's this idea that we're all in this together and we all believe the same thing. And you don't have to be in a Buddhist group for too long to start to discover that people's views of the world and their motivations and the way they respond to things aren't all tidily wrapped up into this sort of net of belief that you'd like to believe. So it's very useful to start to look closely at the nature of suffering. One of the most important things that Namgyal Rinpoche said in classes and to me in retreat specifically was the only meditation experiences that are really valuable are those that give you insight into suffering and into the cessation of suffering. I went to very early on, 1983. I'm in my first 3-week insight retreat, and he throws me into doing Mahamudra. And for the first 10 days, it's like the most extreme form of psychotherapy. Like I'm lying on the floor wailing for the first 6 or 8 days. And like it was just, and he was kind of looking at me every morning for my report, going, oh dear. And then somewhere around day 9 or 10, I had this giant visionary experience. And you got to understand, I'm from Saskatchewan, and my meditative process for the longest time was exemplified by flat and dry. And so I have this giant kind of visionary thing that happens, and like I went running to him the next morning and said, I had this experience and it was great. And and all this happened. And he said, and how he used to, he'd sort of sit over like this and look at you. And he said, okay, and what insight did that give you into suffering and the cessation of suffering? I went, well, none really, but it was super cool. And he just sort of said, go back to work. Like he didn't care about visionary stuff. What he was interested in was this insight. Because, once you start talking to people about meditation, and people are flying in the woods and walking on water and running 200 miles overnight and all that Tibetan stuff, who cares? It's just all kind of, you start to see, and you can see this through drugs if you do that kind of thing, is that this formulation we've got of a concrete and solid reality is flawed to start with, that it's very fluid and movable. And in dream and in other transition states, all sorts of things come up that don't come up in this bardo, this being and normality that we think of this life. But it's really important to start to look at the suffering and not back away from it. And there are ways of doing that in your practice that are constructive and not harmful. Because one of the problems that we have as Dharma teachers when you say this to people is that the really obsessional ones go out and hurt themselves. Because then they say, oh, I got to dig into my suffering. And then there's this big sort of crack up because they re-traumatized themselves. Just start with the easy stuff. Just start with simple things. Don't go for the big home run, knock it out of the park. I'm going to do this all today kind of approach. It's taken years for you to get into the pickle you're in, so don't expect it to turn around in a day. That's just meditation advice for you. So the second part of this is the cessation of suffering. And as I said, a lot of us have difficulty with this part of the program. There are many teachings in Dharma that are divided into these two sorts of camps. The conditioned difficulties and the unconditioned blue sky with no clouds experience. And so the Anapanasati Sutta, which is fabulous, which we're going to be, here's a little bit of Werbung, as they say in German, a little bit of marketing. We're going to be doing the Anapanasati Sutta at this retreat in January at the Dharma Center. But it's divided into two sections, basically. The first 8 steps of the 16 that are described have to do with your conditioning. They have to do with patterns of body, patterns of speech, and patterns of mind. And it says, look very closely at these karmic formations and then allow them to become tranquil. It says that right there, up to point number 8. And then step number 9 is chitta, which means mind or heart. And starting with step number 9 in the Anapanasati Sutta, you have just pure observation. And I've done Anapanasati retreats with people, and a lot of the time people can get up to step number 8, but they get so tied up with cherishing their own flaws or their own conditioning that it gets very difficult just to sit in open clarity. But fortunately, the mind is programmed, or the Anapanasati Sutta is so designed that once you start looking at these things closely, they start to shift and move, and you get these little breaks, these little openings, gaps, as some of the Tibetan teachers call them, that are neither here nor there, that are neither regret about the past or worry about the future, neither guilt nor dread, where there's just this moment of being there. And we kind of think a lot of the time that this is something special that happens to other people, that they have these moments of what is often called transcendent, but is really immanent. It means it's there already. You don't have to go somewhere else for it. But we all have these moments of absolute joyful clarity. And we think that my prairie Protestant pessimism kind of drives me to say, well, that was just sort of an accident, like this joy that I experienced was okay, but it's not going to last, but the closer I looked at it, the more I realized it had to do with being present in what's called the moment. Now, the moment is not, there is no right now, as you can tell, because right now just moved. But there is this moving away from an imaginary past, an imaginary future, and clinging to all the details and the problems and the possibilities of all that, into just being in this place right now. And this is where the cessation of suffering has to begin, is to let go of wanting something that is not happening, wanting something else to be going on. The first of the 5 hindrances in meditation, for those of you that have been into that, is called kamachanda, which means desire for sense experience, but really from a meditative point of view, it means desire for results. It means desire for something to be happening other than what is happening. And from a life point of view, just the same. It's, I wish something was different here. Well, it's not. And what would it look like? Like, it's going to be you all along the way, even if the you that you think of as you is sort of shrunk down to next to nothing. This is whatever it is. And the trick to that is it's gigantic, it's infinite. The present moment is this beginningless and endless tathagata. It's, the word in Pali that's used to describe it is being going. Tathagata just means this state of total isness. And it's accessible at any moment. But in order to get there, you have to give up that thing that you love the most, which is your problem, which is your secret grief or your secret resentments, your aversions and your, sexual fetishes and all that sort of stuff that are all about creating these alternative mental spaces in the present moment that you imagine are a different time or a different place. And so you create this hologram, and then you go, well, that's real, and I want to try and go and live in that hologram. But it's just one quality of this present reality. One of the most difficult things to do is to let go of the body. And so we all have this little bit of, or large amount of dread about the end of the physical body. But this is just a symptom that we can't let go of anything, that we're so stuck on our grief or on our, what they did to me as I was growing up. And there's always a they out there. And once again, once you start to look at who they are, it's a construct inside your own consciousness. There are them out there, but the deal is, here's a bonus. Once you start to recognize the difference between the they that you've created internally and integrate that as, oh, that's me, you can actually start relating to other people as whoever they are, rather than as projections or as attributions of your internal screwed upness. And that's kind of great, because then you can have a conversation with somebody. It's really cool, I got to tell you. But the Mingyur Rinpoche, there's a book called In Love with the World, wonderful book about his 4.5 years that he went walkabout. He escaped from his monastery, the one we went to in Bodh Gaya in February. He just almost literally went over the wall and was gone for 4.5 years. And he talks about how the big death isn't such a big deal if you've dealt with all the little deaths. That if you actually say, that relationship that I had 40 years ago, that I'm still have this little twinge of longing for, doesn't exist. It's just a feeling or a kind of psychosomatic pattern in my nervous system. But you have this longing for something that happened, or this dread of what might happen, and you can't let go of any of it. So if you're not able to let go of stuff that really is completely dead and gone, I mean, like, you're not, I have to look and see, I'm pretty sure none of you are 20 years old anymore. And so that's done. That's finished. There's a teacher in Winnipeg here named Jerry Coppolo, who's brilliant guy, very hard to get along with, but a wonderful human in his own way, who had a terrible accident. He's a photographer, brilliant photographer. He was out on a commercial job early in the morning near Steinbach outside of Winnipeg. And just as the sun was coming up, he was taking pictures of this new building, and the sun got into the eyes of someone driving on the road. And he was driving down the road. I mean, he was standing behind his car with his tripod set up. And this car drove into him and crushed him between their car and his car. And he's, this was 15 years ago, and he's still living with the results of that. But what was interesting in his description of it, which I believe entirely, was that he was on the ground texting. He was in shock, so he couldn't feel anything. He was on the ground texting somebody saying, I don't think I'll be able to make it to class this morning. And that sort of thing. But the woman who drove into him had freaked out completely. And she was sitting, on the side of the road screaming. And he said to her, stop that, it's finished. Which is a brilliant insight to have in the midst of all that. There's nothing to be done now that would reverse what's just happened. And yet we all go on as if weeping and wailing and, tearing of hair and rending of garments, as they say in the Bible, is going to bring us back to some state of imagined grace. The only grace that you've got is right now. It's in this moment. And so what happens with this whole process is very cool, because when you start to allow yourself to let go of the suffering, to let go of the craving, it's not the birth of wisdom, it's not the development of wisdom, it's the recognition of the wisdom that's already inside you. This deep, deep intelligence that is you, as compared to the bonehead who is your surface consciousness. I speak from personal experience. I'm not criticizing you any more than me. Or, the surface consciousness is dopey compared to the depth consciousness, as Rinpoche referred to it, or the original mind, or the natural state, as it's called in Dzogchen. This teaching points towards this deep wisdom that you have inherent in you that only needs to be seen, and you have to learn how to spend more time in that and less time with dum dum. And so there are ways of doing that, and that's what meditation practice is geared for. But there's a very cool thing that I observed, I don't know when, but at some point in all of this, was that the two elements of the fourfold, the Four Noble Truths, are compassion and wisdom. You need to have the suffering, you need to have insight into the suffering in order to have compassion for yourself, in order to have compassion for other people. When you're going through the meat grinder, it's very useful to say, there are probably 1 million people, or 10 million, or 100 million going through this very thing right now, rather than elevating your suffering to make you so goddamn special, because you're not. Your suffering is a product of conditioning, and conditioning is a big territory. It's the culture, it's the climate, it's the force of evolution over 3 billion years, and you're just a leaf on a tree or a bubble of foam in a wave. You're not this gigantic, heroic, romantic figure. So the experience of others' suffering and compassion, you've probably heard this before, means literally with suffering in Latin. And it's to be with others' suffering. It's an extremely important part of the path. This is the beginning of generosity. This is the beginning of love. If you care about somebody, you're curious about them, the whole deal. This is incredibly important for functioning day to day in the world with your mortgage and your flat tires. It's dishes and laundry and all the rest of it. Is you have to understand suffering. At the same time, there has to be this glimmer, this bodhicitta, this spark of understanding that the suffering is an element of this infinite and eternal set of possibilities that is Rigpa, that is the sky without clouds, that is this open natural state. And you can, through retreat and so on, you may come into periods of extended acquaintance with that open natural state. And then you come out of retreat and you think you've moved this far and you've actually moved that far. That's kind of how it works, but at least you've moved that far. And your job is to take it out of retreat and take it on the road, to start to see that open natural state when you're walking down the street or when you're in Shoppers Drug Mart or whatever else. So this requires work, and it requires awareness. And so the thing that knits all this together is awareness and the cultivation of awareness. So you don't need to cultivate wisdom. Wisdom is your birthright. You don't need to cultivate love. Love is your birthright. It's there. What you need to do is cultivate awareness. And so Rinpoche's formula, when he sort of went through a period of doing away with the whole Namo Tassa Bhagavato thing and just said, compassion, awareness, wisdom, that's the path. That's the Four Noble Truths right there. It's compassion, awareness, and wisdom. And this is our job as practitioners. So, in summation, to wrap this up a bit, how is this relevant to me? What am I going to do with this? That was a very nice talk that he just gave. And now I'm going to go back to just screwing around in the way I usually do, and just forget all that. And, it's like when you finish them, you have like the best meditation sit you've ever had in your life. And then the gong goes, you go, okay, back to normal. And maybe you should dispense with that in meditation and with life and start looking for these gaps between your obsession. So first piece of advice is forget about your secret plan for lasting happiness in samsara. Just write it down, do it in like full detail, and then go set fire to it. Chop it up into little pieces and pour lighting fluid on it and do away with it. Second piece of advice, don't turn away from the suffering of others. And don't turn away from the suffering of yourself. Understand that this perception of suffering is a quality of consciousness from which you can learn a great deal. Don't get swept up in blame and attribution. It's kind of a subset of that. In the conflict resolution world, there's this idea of attribution, which is the J.D. Vance thing, where you have just this totally cartoon-like perception of some other human, and you dump all this blame and like hatred on them. And the simplest version of that is the story you make up about somebody who cuts you off when you're in traffic. Right? You're driving down, perfectly innocent human being. I've never done anything wrong. And this person pulls in front of you, and you start making up stories about what an asshole that person is. They do this and they do that, and who do they think they are? And there's, you see the shape of the vehicle in Winnipeg. Here's my version of it. In Winnipeg, it's usually a pickup truck. And people who drive pickup trucks are like this, and they have these attributes and those attributes. You have no idea what's going on with that person. Absolutely none. What their intention was, all you have is this brief flash of action, and you make up this giant story. And we do this all the time. So back that off, all the projections. And this is start to see what might be going on with that person. And just see if you can kindle that little spark of curiosity and caring rather than, oh, that guy, And the last two are cultivate awareness. And as a kind of secondary level, and this is something that I have come to as a kind of necessity as a Dharma teacher, because for a long time, I was one of these people, like there are always people out there, you're going to run into them and say, well, I read somewhere you don't need to meditate, like you just have to be like aware. And like, I'm just practicing awareness. And you meet this person and they're just like this robot of their conditioning, like they have these automatic hatreds and lust and all the rest of it. And so all they're aware of is business as usual. And so what you want to do is a lot more meditation practice, a lot more. And my friend and teacher, Lama Sid, has been beating me up about this because he said, well, you should be doing 10 hours a day. And I said, that's not going to happen, but I can do more than I am. But practice is the place where you can really dig into this stuff, where you can create a safe and somewhat neutral space in order to explore, where you can take refuge in whatever space you've created in your home. You don't have to go to a retreat center. You just have to go to some place that you think that resonates with your practice, that resonates with reminders of the path, and do a lot more meditation. Find people to sit with, because that's very helpful, and work on being part of a sangha, because there are a lot of other people on the path. Dharma is not a solo thing where you sit in a cave for 12 years and then you go out like full blown, now I'm going to fix everybody. Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, and the Sangha part of it is always kind of underemphasized. You will awaken with other people as your support, as your friends, as your advisors, the whole deal. Got to do that. Okay, so that's kind of my encapsulation of the Four Noble Truths as of now. If I do it in 2 weeks, it might be different, but that's the whole schmear. So Karen, do we have time for any questions, or are we just going to sign off because it's 11:04?
Yes, I think it's a good opportunity to open up, and if anybody does have any questions, thank you, Brian. That was excellent.